U.S. spy charges against Chinese students continue to haunt the halls of higher learning. U.S. Attorney for the District Court of Massachusetts, Andrew Lelling, told reporters last Friday that although the U.S. wants to encourage people to come and study, there are thousands of students from China who are directly linked to a state-sponsored effort to steal intellectual property. Currently, there are 360,000 Chinese students studying in the U.S., many of whom have already reported to be feeling the impact of these accusations. Is there concrete evidence supporting such allegations? Is this part of a growing U.S. government-led paranoia about a rising rival? How much is racism a factor? Joining me for the discussion from Washington, D.C. is Professor Christopher Chambers, Professor of Media Studies at Georgetown University, and here in the Beijing studio, Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Now, as I said, Andrew Lelling, the U.S. Attorney for the District Court of Massachusetts, told reporters last Friday that they want to encourage people to come and study, and this isn't about targeting any specific group or anyone who is a Chinese national, but there are thousands who are directly linked to a state-sponsored effort to steal intellectual property. Victor, how true is such a statement? Is there a state-sponsored effort from the Chinese government to steal intellectual property from the United States?
I think Mr. Andrew Lelling's accusation is very much regrettable and is not based on facts. I spent 4 years at Yale University and I got 2 degrees from there, and over the years I've known many Chinese students studying and working in the United States. Many of them eventually chose to stay behind in the United States and got naturalized. Some of them, of course, come back to China. I believe Chinese students studying in the United States eventually become bridges between our 2 great countries and 2 great civilizations, and they are great assets for China-US friendship rather than evil forces damaging to China-US friendship and cooperation. I hope the US government and people like Mr. Lelling will really know the truth and tell the world the truth about the Chinese students in the United States. They are hardworking, very aspiring, and many of them aim high for better relations between our 2 great countries.
Yeah, help us understand, help the readers, the viewers understand a bit better what's the general composition of Chinese students studying in the United States. We know 360,000, that's the number of Chinese students studying annually in the United States. How many of them would be sent on state-sponsored programs to study in the United States, but how many of them would be on their own initiative, their personal choice? They don't have to go through any governmental channels to do that.
No, first of all, Chinese students studying in the United States constitute the largest number of foreign students or international students on the American campuses. That's number one. Number two is that there are Chinese government-sponsored students studying in the United States, but the numbers, in my recollection, only account for about thousands, if not 10,000 people. Most of the Chinese students in the United States are going there on their own, supported by their family members or working their way through their college or graduate studies or professional studies. And they actually don't have any link with the Chinese government at all. And as I mentioned just now, many of them eventually choose to be naturalized and become U.S. citizens in the United States. And I think eventually wherever they work in the United States or here in mainland China, they contribute to greater relations between our 2 countries. And I think accusing large number of Chinese students as spies for the Chinese government is unfair and inaccurate, and also is very false accusation against these innocent students.
And even among those who are sponsored by state funding to study in the United States, their job is to go and exchange and learn the latest knowledge, expertise, skills. Are they there to steal intellectual property, to be spies?
Not at all. I think there is a system in China for the Chinese government to select the best of the Chinese students and professionals who become qualified to go to study in the United States. And this tradition started very early. Actually, it was the first wave of China's opening to the outside world. And Deng Xiaoping, back in 1978, decided to send thousands of Chinese students, sponsored by the Chinese government, to study in the United States. Many of them have returned back to mainland China, have become important leaders in government, in industries, in businesses, in finance, etc. And they've become very outstanding Chinese business people. Many of them, again, choose to stay in the United States and become very successful American citizens. And I would say this tradition will continue, and it will continue to the benefit of China as well as to the benefit of the United States.
Hopefully, if the atmosphere doesn't deteriorate dramatically. Professor Chambers, let me go to you. How do you look at such accusations? And this is not the first time that U.S. government officials talk like this about Chinese students. We understand that last year, the FBI director talked about a whole of government threat. No, rather a whole of society threat on the Chinese part to the United States, and it's calling for a whole of society response by the United States to the possibility, to the spying of Chinese on the American society via students. Professor Chambers, how do you look at the kind of basis of such accusations?
There are many bases for it. I mean, the U.S. Attorney has not been specific about any evidence yet, which tells me that, you know, this is something secret and close to the vest that, you know, we might not even know about until it's too late. A lot of it also is based on, you know, lingering racism. I mean, we can go back 150 years in United States history on that. So there's that aspect too. But it is a general feeling of paranoia in the country towards foreigners, especially foreigners who don't look like the mainstream of the average American student. Now, I might add this. Chinese students going to school, whether it's undergrad, graduate, or professional levels, many of them don't have, or most of them don't have access to the sensitive material that the U.S. Attorney might be worried about. They have access to the same tools that American students use, and they have access to the same clearances to use those tools, and those tools are freely available, many of them on the internet. I mean, in other words, you know, there is no incentive to steal anything that's freely available to you to use as a student to learn what you're here in the United States to learn. So I don't understand what the specific problem is that the U.S. Attorney is getting at. I do understand the general paranoia that is rife and very cancerous in America these days, however.
How do you look at, you talked about foreigners, how do you look at the particularity with Chinese being mentioned here? For instance, visas for Chinese students who want to study in certain fields have been shortened last year, and we're also talking about Chinese specifically, not just one specific group of people who don't look like Americans or who look foreign to the Americans. Why do you think Chinese are particularly highlighted here?
Well, I mean, you have kind of an unstated or stated rivalry economically, in certain aspects militarily in the Pacific. I mean, that's going to generate some paranoia in the United States when you have any kind of hegemony that's threatened. You have the President of the United States basically starting a trade war that probably did not need to be escalated, that could be worked out in other means. And that reverberates through the United States media, especially not necessarily towards university presidents or university students, but the great mass of citizens who might not even have a university education, who need a scapegoat, who need something scary, you know, a monster to focus on, and China becomes, you know, a good target for that. And Chinese students, because of their number, and you know, they're working in many fields, become that convenient monster.
how could this issue be resolved? How could better understanding be reached? How could some reason be put back into the minds of some people who consistently just see the Chinese as a dangerous, the Chinese students as a dangerous group of people? Victor, is there any possibility that you know, we can talk, that reason can be talked here?
I hope so. I think fundamentally China and the United States will need to get along with each other as partners rather than as adversaries or enemies, because otherwise the world will lose its security and people in the world will lose its sanity if China and the United States eventually do come to blows with each other. And therefore, the only choice, the only rational choice between China and the United States, for these two countries to become friendly and more constructive with each other. In that spirit, I think the Chinese students studying in the United States will become important factors for greater relations between China and the United States. I personally don't think a stronger and larger and more powerful China will by definition become an enemy of the United States. China can become a very good partner working with the United States on many international issues or on many important domestic issues in the United States. China has really thrived in working very closely with the United States, and honestly speaking, over the past 40 years, China and the Chinese students, including people like me, have benefited from our contacts with the United States, studying and working with the United States universities and firms, for example, and I hope this will continue. And people in the United States, being very honest and very decent people, will know the truth as it stands and will come eventually to appreciate that better relations between China and the United States is for our mutual benefit.
And basically, the United States, the U.S. economy, the U.S. society have also benefited greatly from the exchange of students, not just from China, but from other parts of the world, I understand. However, Professor Chambers, how do you see the current wave of suspicion, of paranoia against Chinese students continuing? Is this going to last for a while to come, or do you think this is rather short-term phenomenon?
Well, that's an interesting question. Some people think it will last as long as the president and his party are in power. Some people think it'll end fairly quickly as we move on to another issue. I feel that as universities, be they private universities such as mine, Georgetown, or the other guests that studied at Yale, as long as those universities keep a steady path and demand that Chinese students be treated without suspicion, as long as public universities stand up to their state legislatures and say, look, we need these students, I think that this problem can be diffused. And we have seen universities stand up and say, no, this is wrong. You cannot persecute our international students generally or our Chinese students specifically. And the federal government and state legislatures have backed off from attacking the universities or trying to put shackles on them in addition to shortening visas, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's an interesting question as to how long it will take place, but I think that as American universities, be they public or private, stand up to governmental authorities trying to foist these suspicions on Chinese students, I think we'll see the governmental officials back off because when universities do stand up for themselves in this country, we do see government back off. It's when universities shrink or don't say anything, but that's when we see problems.
All right, hopefully that's going to be the case. Many thanks to Professor Christopher Chambers, Professor of Media Studies at Georgetown University, and Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization.